All right, welcome back to Maya. Today I'm just going to talk about how to set up your lights and rendering for your still life. It's like, let's just assume that you have all of your high poly models textured and they have all the materials assigned to them and everything, and you're ready to start lighting your scene and rendering it. Or maybe you're not there and you're just in like milestone 2 or something and you need to set up a render now that you can reuse later. So first thing you might notice about this scene is there is a stage that I have the props on here. It has honestly way more polygons than necessary. I can delete all these. And the same for horizontally. Yeah. Something you should consider whenever you set up a render for your just anything that you do is to have something to set your objects on. You don't want them to just be like floating in space. So here I just have a very simple countertop and wall that I also textured in Substance Painter. You'll be able to see it when I start rendering stuff. But beyond that, after you have your little stage set up, I have it fairly large so that it'll cover the entire camera whenever I get to rendering. But we're going to talk about camera stuff later. Now let's get to lighting. So if you have any reflective objects in your scene, which you probably will with the glossy paint tubes and probably a metallic canister or part of the paintbrushes will have metallic materials on them, you'll want something for those reflective surfaces to actually reflect. Because if you just have a ambient light sky dome like this, and you start doing the render, all the reflective things are just going to look pure white, and it's not going to be very interesting. Like if I pull up the preview renderer by going under render and then clicking this Arnold option here, it'll give me this thing. I'm just going to dock it on top of the attribute editor so that it's not in the way of my viewport. And this thing, what it'll do is just give you a very quick preview GPU render in your viewport. It'll lag your Maya pretty badly though, so be careful with it. Yeah, so you can see it's pretty grainy at first, and if you let it sit still for a bit, it'll give you a slightly more clear render. And this is not how you want to do your actual render. This is just what you want to use to like get a quick preview of making sure that your materials and everything are all working properly. I'm gonna change my computer's settings because they are heating up a bit. 1 second. I'll pull up my there we go. Hopefully now my computer won't overheat when I try to use this, and I can actually touch my laptop without it burning up. At least I think that'll be okay. Alright, so to give something for your metallic things to reflect so that they're not just like boring white or gray, there are a couple of things you can do for the Skydome light. The easiest way to handle it is to assign an HDRI image to the color map here. Same way that you would assign a color map to the other objects in your scene. So I'm going to go to hdrihaven.com. And this website just has a bunch of, okay, whatever. This website has a bunch of free like open source HDRI images that you can just assign to your skyboxes, and it'll give your metallic things something to reflect. It has little previews on these thumbnail images here of what various materials will look like in that skybox. So I'm gonna look for one that is indoor to do my render. I don't care. Okay. Um, let's pretend that our setup is in like a kitchen or living room or something. So let's find something that looks a bit like that, like this kitchen studio HDRI. Cool. I don't care. I don't necessarily need 8K. I'm just gonna go with 4K and download it. And it'll give me this .hdr file into my downloads folder, which I'm going to grab once my file explorer wants to load. Oh, wrong folder. And I'm just gonna paste it in here so I can find it more easily. And I'm going to click that checker box there on the color map of the Skydome Light attributes. I'm going to click File, and I'm going to go into the folder where I saved it. And I'm just going to assign that HDRI to the Skydome. And it will give you this funny preview of the skybox all around your objects. And I'm going to take another preview render, look at it to see if I like how the reflections look now. I have to give it a bit because now it has all the reflections and lights to calculate from the skybox. This will make your render time take quite a lot longer. And woo, okay. We have lots of stuff we're reflecting now. I don't exactly like how intense it is with the lighting. So I'm going to take this intensity value and I'm going to lower it so that it's just kind of a simple ambient light to fill in the background spaces of the scene. And you can see we have some reflections going on our metallic pieces of our paintbrushes going on now. All right. So I made by lowering the intensity there, I just decreased how much effect that the light from the skybox has on the objects here. Because I want the main source of light to be my 3-point light setup, which I'm now going to cover. There are lots of tutorials online for how to set up a 3-point light system in Maya, both and in real life actually, because this is basically what all professional like studio photographers use to like set up their scenes. So the idea of a 3-point light setup is you have your key light, which is just filling in most of the light in the scene, a fill light so that the shadows are covered in. So like if I'm looking at it from here, then like these parts over here are probably going to be in shadow. So I want this fill light, which is going to be a little bit dimmer than the key light. The key light's going to be the brightest, and the fill light is going to be the second brightest. And then lastly, we have an accent light or a rim light. There's a couple of different names for it. And this one is going to be the dimmest and probably a different color from the rest of the lights. And then, of course, we have the like ambient studio lighting in the background. So I didn't change the intensity, the exposure, or anything like that on any of these lights. Let's just see how they look to start off. It's like, wow, Susanna, these have literally no effect on the entire scene. Oh, that's because we need to turn the intensity and the exposure up. So intensity and exposure are They both affect the brightness of the light. So like if I turn intensity all the way up, then you might not see any results because exposure might be more dramatic. It also depends on how big your scene is. So like by default, you might notice that intensity and exposure don't go up that high. So I can just take it to even higher numbers. Whoa, that is way too high. Let's turn that down to 10 for each of them. And my gosh, that is still too bright. I don't want 9000, I want 9.0. Ideally, you want your intensity exposure to share the same value for each of your different lights. So yeah, for my scene, it looks like 8 for the intensity and exposure is... Actually, can I go to 9 again? I just want to see. Because you definitely want your key light here to be the brightest. I'm going to call this one key. Well, looks like that's a bit too much, so I'm just going to turn that down to 8. Or maybe I should turn down the intensity of the background more, so that there's more emphasis on these lights here. Still a bit too bright. Yeah, I turned that down and turn this up a bit. These values have different effects. I think intensity is like how much it is at close range, and or intensity is how much it is like at longer range, and exposure is like it affects more at a close range. You kind of just get a feel for it after fiddling with it for a bit. I You can also use colors for your lights or color temperature. I like to use color temperature and just leave the key light white most of the time. And then let's see, where's my fill light? It's over here. So let's see. This one is about 12 and 8. I'm going to turn this one to 10 and 7 because that'll probably give me a pretty good estimate of how it should feel. And I want this one to be a warmer light, so I'm going to turn the temperature value lower. And then the last one, I'm going to make a, let's say 8 and 5 for the intensity exposure. And I want this one to be more cool colored. It's a bit too cool. I want it to be less dramatic. Like, say maybe it's not getting in the kind of accents that you want. You can move it around and change the angle of it. For me, it's inside of the wall right now. I don't want that. Okay, yeah. Is it possible to turn off its reflection of the source in the ground? Looks like it's not really. So I'm just going to move it up and point it down so that it's not like showing in my reflection so much. Alright, well, that's a pretty simple 3-point light setup that you can do for like literally any model setup that you make ever. Move around, maybe make your key light a bit larger so that it covers a wider area, and have your sky dome. You can also have your sky dome be colored using a ramp. I'm not gonna do that right now just because it's more valuable to have the reflections, at least for this assignment and render. Hat trick Had to take a drink real quick. But for now, let's just worry about this render and not like more abstract ones. Okay, now that we have our lighting set up, let's get to camera framing. So these two options right here, the gate mask and the resolution gate, you will want to turn these on to get your framing set up. This gray box that it makes here is the frame in which the Arnold renderer will create its render. So you want to make sure that your still life is all neatly composed in this little gate here. You can even turn on some measurements if you want to be super nerdy about photography. I'm not super into photography, so I just kind of make a guess about how it should look. And then once you have it about right and things are all in like safe action zone, and go into view and go into bookmarks, and I'm going to make a new bookmark and I'm going to name this one render. So that anytime I want to like zoom out and maybe edit these lights and their values, I can just go back to bookmarks, click on this render button, and it'll take me right back to where I need to be to have the final render. And then like, say I make a fully fleshed out render and I'm like, oh no, one of my textures is missing or one of the lights is way too bright, then you can just go back to that bookmark and then you can just redo the render without having to worry about making it hard to compare your two renders to each other. Okay, now let's get into some of the rendering options. I'm not going to talk about camera options today because Brigitte was going to cover that in a different lecture. So I'm just going to look at the render settings under Arnold, which you'll find by clicking this little director's clapboard here with the little gear on it next to the Hypershade button. So the most important thing about your render is to make sure the preset is set to HD 1080. So they have a 1920 by 1080 render with 72 ppi and everything. And you're rendering from just the I'm gonna render from the perspective camera view rather than this other render cam that I made in the past that I did to edit the depth of field and stuff. I'm not going to be covering depth of field today, just normal stuff. Ideally, if your computer has a good GPU, you should have your render device set to the GPU. And sometimes it'll give you a device fallback option to render with a CPU. Rendering with the GPU goes way faster and makes the lighting. It has a different effect on how the lighting will turn out. It's closer to how the preview render Arnold thing that uses your GPU ideally if you have one. So if you do this one, then it will look like how you prepared it with this one. I set the camera anti-aliasing to 12 because I like to get a really crisp render. That'll make it take like half an hour to render probably if you want to do that. So for the sake of this demo, I'm gonna turn it down to like 8 or something. But if you try to do a render with the GPU and it doesn't work out, you can render with the CPU instead. I guess now it's giving me that option because the anti-aliasing is a low enough value for the CPU to be able to take it on. So I have these, but if you do render with the CPU, then there are a lot of things that you can do here to make your render really pretty. I'm not going to worry about any of these stuff. I am going to go to ray depth and go to these options and make them set to 12:2 and not change the other ones. I don't want motion blur because I'm not doing an animation. But I'm just going to do GPU render today rather than CPU. And, oh, right, yeah, you can still do that for the GPU for the ray depth and everything, just not all this other stuff. Right, I'm going to open up my render view portal here. Oh, it's like, and I am going to render the current frame. I'm going to pause the recording so that my computer can render the frame faster, and I will come back after it's done. Okay. Oh shoot, I didn't actually pause it. But it does look like the thing that I just did, removing the Arnold preview render and switching back to viewport, worked pretty well. I'm gonna actually pause it now. Okay, looks like that render worked out pretty well. It took only about 2 minutes because I was using the GPU instead of the CPU. But I did render using the wrong camera, it looks like, because it's way more zoomed out than the one I'm actually using. I guess I should have just used the default one that was listed as render cam. But yeah, you can see with those settings, you can even zoom in on your render with the same controls that you have for um, the rest of Maya, which is just like scrolling and holding Alt and middle click and drag, zoom around. You can see that it's a bit blurry because I didn't set the camera anti-aliasing level to be really high. The highest I would ever set it is probably just to 12, like I had it before, but that will cause it to take like exponentially longer with the higher the value is. I can show you what it looks like when I do have it with the camera at the proper position and with the 12 anti-aliasing value. And that's the milestone 2 render. That's not the right one. It's going to be my milestone 3 folder, which is this one. Yeah, so this is what it is at the higher anti-aliasing value. And you can see that looks way prettier. If you click on my YouTube channel, you can actually see there's another video that I just have publicly uploaded where I talked about how to assign Udemy tiles to these props here. And it'll have the exact same thumbnail that is in this image. Just a little fun fact. You can even see I have an HDRI reflection in here, just like I did before. I have no idea what image I used. I probably have it in my source images folder. Well, not that I can see. Oh well. Oh yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover for today. And remember, if you have any of those like red text error things when you try to do your GPU render with this button here, the render current frame, or you can find it in the render view right here. It's probably because you left your preview render, Arnold preview render open and you didn't switch back to viewport. Because you can only have one of those open at a time, I guess. So just make sure you switch back to viewport whenever you do your final render, and then just let the Arnold render view take care of the rest. I don't think there's anything more I really have to say about it. I suppose if you really wanted, you could take this image into Photoshop and mess with the curves of the image and maybe make the darker spots a bit lighter or turn down the intensity of these really bright highlights. But I like how it looks with these reflections of the lights and everything. So I'm just going to leave it as it is and pretend that I actually did properly crop it correctly to be like that resolution or whatever with this size. Rather, this resolution with the camera being positioned correctly. Um, so if you do, yeah, you'll probably want to take like a perspective screenshot like this with your tile map over it. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything more I have to cover because we've already talked about how to assign textures and make everything high poly, and I think you know the topology of your models better than I do for how to UV map them. So yeah, I think that's all I have to talk about for the rest of this project. Maybe not for the entire project. I'll probably come up with something more to cover next week. But all right, bye bye.